Welcome back. Today I want to go over a couple of things. We certainly want to review Module 1, things that we went over. We want to preview Module 2, what's going on there, and speak specifically about some of the assignments coming up, particularly the peer review. This is the first time that we've done a peer review, and so I want to spend some time working out the schedule. I don't want this to catch anybody by surprise. The schedule for the peer reviews is different. You cannot get extensions on the peer review just by the nature of the way that activity is done. And so I want us to all be clear about the expectations there and the scheduling of it. Before I get into those three things, however, I do want to talk about the forums. Thank you so much for all of you who are participating on the forums, who are responding to one another, giving great feedback, sharing your own experiences in relationship to what others have said, asking questions of each other. I really do think that the forums and the dynamics on the forums is what makes or breaks a course like this. A couple of you were thinking about online education. And for instance, in the last lecture essay that was linked in some of the notes, there was a comment that there's no substitute for the classroom. Now, that was written some time ago, and we've moved more and more towards online and digital classrooms of one sort or another. And the question has always been, for a digital platform like ours, how do you reproduce the kind of social dynamic, because so much learning is social, especially if we're thinking in this constructivist way. How do we reproduce that social dynamic? And the forums is the major way that we do that for our platform. And so thank you so much for your participation there. I hope that momentum continues throughout the course. Let's start then by reviewing what we went over in Module 1. One of the major things that we went over is thinking about inductive and deductive approaches to teaching. As so many of you pointed out, most of us use a blended version of this. There's times that we use induction, times that we use deduction. And of course, when we're talking about deductive and inductive approaches, we're thinking about, do we start with models and theories and then move towards the application or testing of those models and theories? That would be deductive. Or do we start with raw materials and from that produce interpretations or theories or generalizations? That would be inductive. When we have categories like this, I want to be clear that we're not trying to suggest that one is superior to the other. Rather, these categories hopefully make us more conscientious about what we really want our students to achieve and how we're going about helping them to achieve it. As some of you pointed out, there are factors of time. Inductive approaches often can take more time. There's issues of subject matter and students' level of development. For instance, if students are new to a subject, I can't expect them to inductively pick out complex patterns. If I'm going to use induction in that case, those patterns need to be pretty obvious. But we want to be conscientious about what we're doing and why we're doing it. Why is this the effective way of approaching the material, the skill that I'm trying to convey to my students or have my students engage? We also talked about and dealt with Bloom's taxonomies and variations of that taxonomy. Just like with induction and deduction, the purpose of thinking through that taxonomy or taxonomies is really to make us more conscientious about the learning outcomes that we want for our students and how what we do in the classroom is aligned with those goals that we have for our students. There's nothing wrong with a course that emphasizes those lower levels of Bloom's taxonomies. most of us need that in fields in the early going. But we want to make sure that what we do in the classroom is aligned with wherever it is that we're headed within that subject matter. We also talked about behaviorism and constructivism as teaching theories. And while our class is primarily built around this idea of constructivism, we don't want to leave behind some of the insights that behaviorism and other theories of learning have offered to us. So really the purpose of Module 1 is to help us build a foundation, to think about teaching, what we do as teachers, approaches to teaching. As we turn to Module 2, we're going to be thinking more about learning. How do our students learn, and really how do all of us learn? And that's going to involve memory in a very, very significant way. So we'll be thinking about memory as well. But before I turn to Module 2 and all the concepts in Module 2, let me turn to this idea of the peer review and the schedule for it. Unlike most of the portfolio assignments and the reflective journals, the peer review has a different schedule. There are two parts of the peer review. The first is your response to the prompt itself. This is due Saturday evening by 11 p.m. That's Eastern time here in the United States. The reason for that is that in the early morning of Sunday, the system shifts from you entering your response to distributing to all of you 3 responses from your peers that you will then respond to. Give feedback on those 3 entries that your peers made. So the whole system requires everyone to be on that schedule, to submit their initial responses by Saturday evening, and then between early Sunday morning and Tuesday to respond to what your peers have said. Now, as you think about that response to your peers, there will be some questions for you to answer. But really, this is a chance for you to ask questions, to point to what seems particularly insightful to you, to point to what surprises you or how you might react similarly or differently. An initial descriptive response, being able to assure your peer that you have heard and seen what they have to say, and then reacting to it, gives your peer a chance to think carefully about what did or didn't work in their response and how others are reacting to it that they might reconsider. Let's now look at Module 2 and what we have going on in Module 2. Like I said, Module 2 is about the learning process. We're going to think about dual process theory, System 1 and System 2. System 1 being those things and that recall that is automatic, that we do often without thinking very much at all about it, that's very quick, it's fast. And then there's System 2, which is thinking more slowly, more carefully, in more complicated ways, in conscientious ways. And our teaching often involves both of these. You know, if I'm teaching language, for instance, eventually I want so much of that process of coming up with words and structuring them to become automatic, become System 1. If I'm doing a lot of analysis of something, I want to develop that System 2 processing. We're going to think about memory a lot. How do we encode? How do we store? How do we retrieve memories? Because if we want our students to be able to recall material, we need opportunities to think about what we do, what kind of activities, what kind of environment we produce that will help our students to encode, store, and retrieve those memories in the way that we want them to. We also want to think about what gets in the way of learning. One of the main things we'll think about is what we're going to call the gap of minds. This came up a little bit in the forums. There is, for most of us, a distance in time, in space, in understanding between where we are now and where our students are. And that can be a problem in the teaching and learning process. What I take for granted, having been part of my discipline for decades, my students can't take for granted. They don't know what I just think, everybody knows this. So how do we break down that gap in knowledge? How do we remember what it was like to be a student, where we were, what foundation we don't have as a student that we as professors do have, and how do I get my students to understand and build that foundation that I take for granted. As part of helping our students remember things, we want to talk about levels of abstraction and think about how our students deal with levels of abstraction. How do we build from the concrete to more abstract concepts and thinking? We also want to think about the use of analogies. This can be so helpful in helping students process and remember knowledge, experiences, theories, skills that we want them to have. We'll be engaging in a discussion of motivation as well. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, or putting them in situations where they can develop intrinsic motivations for their engagement with the learning process. But we need to acknowledge that much of our teaching and much of the system in which our teaching exists is built around extrinsic motivations, things like grades, things like scores. So how do we, but because those extrinsic motivations tend to be short-lived, tend to not produce the kind of learning mindset that we're trying to inculcate in our students, how do we also engage them and help them develop intrinsic motivation? Along with motivation, we want to think about things that demotivate our students. And a lot of these are social pressures of one sort or another. And so we want to think about how to negotiate those social pressures. In fact, the peer review that you're going to be doing is one in which you're given a scenario of a particular student who seems to be losing motivation. And you'll be asked to think through, how do you diagnose that student and what that student's going through? And then think about how to help that student overcome those motivational barriers. As far as assignments go, you have, as with every module, the initial and final reflected journal. There will be some quizzes along the way, because these first two modules really are about producing a knowledge base for us. We want to take advantage of the testing effect. That's something we'll talk about this week, and how that promotes memory. And so that's why there are these small quizzes along the way. But the big assignment will be the peer review assignment that's due Saturday evening. Those are the big things that we're doing. I look forward to talking to you more on the forums, and I'll talk to you again next week.